Hello, Garland Nixon here, and the U.S. is once again talking about launching air strikes on Venezuela. Let's talk about the interesting use of language here. Let's talk. Hello, Garland here. And so, all this talk about launching airstrikes on Venezuela, one of the things I like to do sometimes is to dig into language. Um, language is very, very important. And oftentimes people tell on themselves based on the language that they use. And the reason I tend to do this is people know in my investigation days, one of the courses I took was statement analysis. And it's very important to look at the words people say. They'll tell on themselves a lot, right? So let's talk. Let's do that a little bit. And there's a word that's used that I think we need to dig into: strikes. The U.S. is considering air strikes. There's all of these articles, right? Senator Chuck Grassley compares Trump's strikes on Venezuela boats to Obama's strikes in Libya. You notice the Empire always uses that word strikes, right? Trump tees up land strikes in Venezuela. Oh, he's just going to strike land. No people are going to get hurt. Well, that's important. Uh, Oklahoma lawmaker backs drone strikes in Venezuela. Boat strikes, land strikes, right? Okay, let's do this. Let's look up the definition of the word strike. Shall we do that together? To hit sharply, as in with a hand, fist, or implement, strike the table in anger. Now, when you talk about self-defense, there are various kind of strikes, right? Open it, boom, strikes. There are various kind of strikes, right? Hit this part of the hand, use the fingers, poke in the eyes, strikes, boom, like do an eye strike, and it's like, like the cobra comes out, pow, right in there, and hit you, right? Boom, it's a strike. What is interesting about that strike, right? This cobra, to the eyes, right? It's one time. It's a single action, a punch. A strike is a punch, some kind of a strike. Because when we talk about normally, and not from the perspective of like, say, training yourself with self-defense, you only think of a punch, but there are various kind of strikes. Elbow strikes, right? You'll learn the 5 elbow strikes, knee strikes, open hand strikes, you name it, right? All kinds of strikes. But that doesn't imply a strike, doesn't imply a fight. I mean, it could start a fight. You would think if you strike someone, they're going to strike you back, but not necessarily. What happens if you strike someone and you knock them out unconscious with one hit? So the idea, actually, the ideal thing to happen in a conflict is you have your adversary, and for whatever reason you need to strike your adversary. The ideal thing is to strike your adversary one time, knock them unconscious, they fall out, and you go away safely. That wouldn't that be ideal? Ideal strike is a one-time thing only. Decapitation strikes, we use that term. What does that mean? That means we're going to cut off the head, the command center, the leadership of your country, and then the whole country would just fall into disarray, and there's nothing to back it up. It implies there's not enough organization in this country to come back, right, after a decapitation strike. That if we get rid of everybody in charge, that your country doesn't have the level of organization that would allow it to survive. And so we can just come in and just walk in and take over at that point. But again, strike is not a war. Big difference. For instance, right now, the U.S. is speaking about strikes on Venezuela. Venezuela is preparing for war. Venezuela is giving guns and making sure that millions of people are trained with their guns, their militia. They're ready for war. What is that? They're ready for a long-term conflict. They're ready to defend. They're ready to attack. They're ready to do all of the things necessary. And a big part, there's a big book here called On War, by General Karl von Clausewitz, right? And it talked about war as a holistic thing. And it talks about having the people behind the war, how critical that is, right? There's some main things he gets on, but one of the things that he discusses is making sure the people are behind the war. So you're looking at Venezuela. I've been there. The people will be behind defending their country. And in the same way that in Iran, that when the U.S., when Israel, the U.S.'s proxy attacked Iran, the support for the government increased, as anybody could predict it will. People tend to circle the wagons. There's a saying in the Middle East, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me, my brother, and my cousin against you. In other words, the outsider is the old person that always gets pushed away. That's the way the world works. You can like tribalism or not, but there's a level of it everywhere. So at any rate, when the U.S. says strikes, blitzkrieg, right? We're going to hit you so hard that you can't recover. We're going to knock you out with one punch. Here's the problem with that. If you're training for self-defense, you have to train for strength so that you have, hopefully, ideally, the strength to knock your opponent out with one punch. But you also have to train your cardiovascular system. What happens if you swing and you miss? What happens if you swing and hit the person and it doesn't bother them? What happens if now this is not somewhere you just grab each other and wrestle each other to the ground? Like this becomes a prolonged thing. What if 3 people come out of the alley behind them and they're all chasing you and you have to run because you've decided, hey, to fight 3 guys with knives or flee, I'm going to flee, right? You got to be in a physical condition. You got to be able to fight in the short run and strength for that. But you also have to be able to get the hell out of Dodge or to fight someone for a long time if it's a long fight, right? Stamina, strength and stamina. So what's happened is, what you see, you go to the gym sometimes and you see these guys bumping and they're all day, they've got their knees wrapped and their wrists wrapped and they're trying to push as much weight as they can and they're using gravity, and they get up for whatever it is. But you look at them and you see they have no stamina. That if they get in a fight, they're going to try to grab somebody and bear hug them and throw them to the ground, or they're just going to try to knock somebody out because there's no skills there. There's just raw strength and power. And raw strength and power has weaknesses because there's areas that you can't build. Can you build here? Can you build here? You build here? Can you build your so many places, your kneecaps, the inside of your ankles? There's lots of places that people can strike. Sorry about that. Somebody called, and unfortunately, I forgot to turn off my phone. Hold on. There we go. So at any rate, where were we? So my point being this: the United States comes across to me like the big muscle guy who can only throw a punch and hope to knock you out. We're going to strike country X. We're going to throw a punch and hope to knock them out. And if it doesn't, then what do we do? Because what we do then is we strike, like Yemen. We launched these massive airstrikes against you. And we blew up things. We said, oh, we blew up a hotel and killed everybody in to get one guy. Ha, ha, ha. Oh, we blew up government buildings. Oh, we do this. We launched strikes, and Yemen just kept coming because Yemen wasn't there for an occasional strike. They weren't there to, to take a punch and get knocked out. They were there for the long run, right? They were there to say, hey, look, we have a issue that we feel is of moral consequence, and we're going to stand for this issue no matter what. And all the strikes in the world aren't going to stop us. And when the U.S. runs into that, as they would if they attack Venezuela, which I doubt if they will, but again, it's possible. I'm going to go right now 60-40 that the U.S. doesn't, but who knows? But at any rate, it's the same thing. Here you have a country, I'll put it to you like this. How can the U.S. do anything else other than strikes? Because other than strikes would be to put in an expeditionary force of soldiers. Well, we got 16,000 people. That ain't going to get the job done in that country against literally millions of civilians and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. That's not going to get it done. They get wiped out on the first day. So in jungles, they get bit by snakes, slide down, hills into the water, and it look like they end the last 20 minutes of Predator. So the bottom line is this: the only option the U.S. has is to attempt to like a what would you say? like a surgical attack, right? We're going to find the leadership and kill the leadership. But then you're counting on something else that doesn't happen, and that is we find the leadership and kill the leadership. But then we then have to believe that if that happens, the rest of the country just falls, and that doesn't happen. Doesn't happen at all. But why is it that we do these strikes? I think it's this. Read von Clausewitz, and he talks about war and the importance of having, and plenty of people have talked about when it comes to war. Another book over there, People's War, People's Army, General Diop from uh, um, Vietnam. You'll notice that the Vietnamese and the Russians both talk about having the people behind you if you're going to win a war, about the importance of fighting a war in a more holistic way, taking things into account, such as, how the people view the government, whether the people view the government that they're defending better than the other options. There's lots of things to take into consideration. But just the idea that I'm going to fly some F-35s over a country, or I'm going to throw some Tomahawks at a country and hit some critical spots, and the entire country is just going to fold up. It's preposterous. But I have to do that. Why is it, if I'm the US, that I have to do, quote, strikes? In fact, if I'm the US, why is it that I developed a war fighting manner, right? That is, I'm going to stay way offshore with ships, and I'm going to throw stuff at you from long ways away. I'm going to take bombers, but even those bombers are not necessarily going to have bombs to fly over you. They're going to have missiles that they can fire from a safe distance. That this is all about firing long-range weapons at somebody from a distance. Why? It goes back to, you have to have the people behind you in a war, because in a war, you're going to take losses. In a fight, you're going to take punches, right? In a war, you're going to take losses. So right now, can Donald Trump have bodies coming home from Venezuela? Planes shot down, troops killed on the side of a mountain. What happened? Oh, we had a brigade of soldiers got surrounded on the side of a mountain and cut to pieces. Can Donald Trump do that? Can that hit the news? Oh, well, we had a ship that got hit by a, whatever missile, and 150 soldiers died. Can Donald Trump face that? What does he do then? Oh, okay, we're really going to go to war now. Okay, great. As they say, how do you spell Vietnam in Spanish? Venezuela. So the idea of strikes, period, and the reason that the U.S. is always talking about launching strikes against Iran, here's what everybody knows. Can the U.S. do a ground war against Iran? Absolutely not. We don't have the ground troops. We don't have, we have an all-volunteer army. And of course, the United States can't take those kind of troops coming home, because if the U.S., if we had it, which we don't. So what are we going to do? Now, let's do this differently. In the kinetic world, what are we going to do? If we want to have some military conflict with Iran, what are our options? Are our options in any way, shape, or form ground troops? No, it's not an option. We don't have the troops to do it if we wanted to. We don't necessarily have the capacity to bring them to an area in the Middle East where they could be dispatched to go through the mountains and fight foot by foot, kilometer by kilometer through the mountains of Iran. That's really a plan? It's not. It's not a plan. So a ground war against Iran is not an option. In the same way that a ground war against Venezuela is not an option. Let's go one further. What does that tell you? That for the U.S. empire, and quite frankly, for Europe, I would say this: ground wars are not an option, because we can't come home to the people and say, okay, all your sons are dead. In fact, there's a reason, if you think about it. This German general recently said, French general said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, that, French people have to get ready and get accustomed to the idea that their sons have to go die in a war with Russia. Why did he say that? People are like, oh my God, he said that. I can't believe he said that. But let's go about why he said that. Why do you have to say that? Because he knew they're not. He had to say, yes, the French people must be prepared and ready and must be strong and prepared to throw their sons into battle so they could die against Russia. Why? But you can freak out over he said it, but he shouldn't have had to say it. But he did, didn't he? Because he knows damn sure well the French people ain't. And if they try to throw him in a war against Russia, they're all getting their heads cut off in guillotines. So he had to say it. But everybody focused on what he said, not the fact that why would he have to say that if people were all ready to do it? So what we have is we have a reality for colonialism. Because what America does is a form of, you can call it imperialism, you can call it colonialism, but the idea that the United States can say to Venezuela, a country that has more oil than anybody in the world, you know what? We're calling Venezuela. Hello, Venezuela government. Yeah, your president needs to resign, and we're going to put a president in power. Venezuela says no. Yeah, you have to do that right away, or else we're going to attack you and kill lots of people. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. So now the U.S. has to do what? We're going to throw tomahawks at you. We got 250 of them. What if that's a big country? So what if Venezuela says, yeah, we can take 250 tomahawk hits? What the hell? We've been the last month. We knew you were going to attack us. You think we didn't move everything off of every base? You think everything of value has not been moved, hidden in the jungles, camouflaged, gotten out of bases? Everything we have is moved. So all of your targets that you've been planning for the last month, we've been getting everything the hell out of there. Go ahead, fire 250 tomahawks. And then what are you going to do? What are you going to do if we just say, well, 250 tomahawks just came in, but this is a pretty big country, so it really didn't do a lot of damage. That's weird. So then what? What is your regime change plan other than we're going to throw some tomahawks and some bombs at them? And if that doesn't work, we don't have a plan B, because there is no plan B. Somebody said Vietnam 4.0, but it can't be. Here's why we cannot possibly compare Venezuela to Vietnam. I'll give you some reasons. Here's one. Venezuela is, very, very close to the U.S. border. If the United States starts some kind of a conflict there, I don't know if you know this, a whole hell of a lot of Vietnamese showed up here after the war, right? And during and after the war, a lot of Vietnamese people showed up here. How about this? You think there's not going to be any people along that South American area where there's war and mayhem going on? You don't think any of them are going to show up on our border? 1 million people show up on our border. 1 million refugees will be on our border. Anybody who even lives anywhere near the area will come to the border and say, I'm a war refugee. They'll be from 5 countries away. If they've decided it's time to come, it's perfect time. There's a war going on. I don't care who it is. If I want to come, El Salvador, Guatemala, Venezuela, it doesn't matter what the country is, I'm going to show up at the border and say I'm a war refugee. The Haitians will be there. You name it. Everybody's going to be on the border claiming to be millions. That's a guarantee. Number 2, the United States, if you remember what happened earlier, we got in there and our general says, you give me 500,000 soldiers and I'll be done in like 6 months, right? But we had 500,000 soldiers. Back then, we could do a draft. Forget trying to do a draft. They'll burn this country down if you try to do a draft. So here's the issue. How are you going to get 100 million soldiers? In order to get the Vietnam, 500,000 soldiers. In order to turn this into Vietnam, you got to put 500,000 soldiers into Venezuela. But you ain't got 500,000 soldiers. You ain't got 100,000, so 16,000. That's what we could muster. That was it. It seems to me like a bluff. And if it ain't a bluff, then what? You'll be humiliated. You'll fly over. You'll drop some bombs. They'll do no good. You'll throw some tomahawks. They'll do no good. And the Venezuelans will say, yeah, well, sorry, we're not giving up. So what? You're going to bomb some locations around? Yep. A lot of our people in our government are in hiding. So we got a lot of jungles. Good luck finding them in the jungles. That's what you're going to see. And what are we going to bomb for a couple of days? Bomb for a couple of weeks? Whatever. Bomb for a couple of months. Doesn't matter. Well, we got 250 tomahawks. How long are they going to last? And what are we going to do? Go rearm and bring another 250? But again, at some point, if you're going to take over this country, don't you have to go in? You have to have soldiers at some point, and we don't have them. And if they go in, they'll be slaughtered by millions of people with guns. By all the talk about America, yes, we'll fight. The Venezuelans will. And the thing I always say is this. Maduro's a dictator. Well, isn't that the stupidest thing in the world for the dictator to arm his own people? If you are some kind of a dictator, that means the people hate you. And if you give them all guns, there'll be a revolution, right? So why would a government that's hated by its people arm its own personnel? The only reason I can think of is because they know that those civilians are on their side, or they wouldn't give them guns. The government's giving people guns and helping to train people, and there's militias. I've been there. I can tell you right now, they're all going to fight. If you go there, if you go um, the Venezuela, the Venezuelans are going to fight, and you're in a jungle. I don't know who's playing that. Who thinks that's a good plan? I don't know who thinks it's a good plan to fight in the jungles of Venezuela. Well, but if we could, but we can't, because when 16,000 soldiers ain't fighting, and wherever they go, they're going to get fired on if they come into Venezuela. So it seems like a bad situation. I wouldn't be jumping into that if I was Trump. I mean, there's a level of desperation, and it's like, look, we're in bad shape financially. We're really, really screwed financially. So here's what we need to do. Let's just cook up a cockamamie lie. We know it's absurd, ridiculous, and nobody with half a brain would believe it. But any way you look at it, I think the Trump administration now understands desperation. I think the Trump administration is saying, look, we're very, very desperate, and we don't know what else to do because we're going to go broke, and we need access to this oil, both to sell the oil with ConocoPhillips and those companies, and at the same time, we need the Wall Street needs these companies for collateral to leverage again and sell all kind of weird financial tools that we don't even understand. So the bottom line is they need this to get out from under this ungodly economic hole that we are in, but they ain't going to get it. It's going to cost money, and political capital is, to say the least. So the bottom line, I just don't see how they can do it. And this is the most important one, I think. 70% of Americans, have you seen the polls? 70% of Americans are in opposition to this conflict. Not conflict, excuse me, just a criminal war of aggression against Venezuela, an attack on Venezuela. 70% of Americans are already opposed to it, and you're going to launch attack on Venezuela that 70% of Americans are opposed to. Oh, by the way, when do the primaries kick off? Like pretty much the 1st of January, so 3 weeks before that. So what do? Maybe bomb Venezuela or throw stuff at it for 3 weeks. Again, they may throw stuff back. They may have some success. You may lose some Americans, and that ain't going to work out good for you. So maybe Trump does it. Let me look and see if I see anything about it. I have all along, I just haven't believed that he would do it. Let me look on Telegram. Do I see anything? No. I don't see anything. A brilliant warship. Wait a minute. Let me see. What's this say? A Brazilian warship is currently sailing east along Venezuela's northern coast, just off the shores of Curacao and Caracas. Its radar system capable of blah blah blah. The ship is back in Caribbean theater. Look, don't think that don't think that Brazil or any of these other countries are going to necessarily intervene, because most of the countries in South America are very, very militarily weak, and that's on purpose. The United States has made sure that all of these countries are extremely militarily weak, just so they can do whatever they want to, just so nobody could possibly challenge them. And Venezuela is not a strong country, but they do have I'll put it like this. They've got some very able planes, only a couple dozen of them. These Su-30s is a pretty darn good plane. But, there's other things we're not sure. They apparently have some Russian missiles. We don't know if they have the newest anti-ship missiles. We're not so sure about their whether they have S-300s and what version. I think they do, but I don't know what version. So there's a lot of questions about what they have. But all of that being said, even if the United States can easily fly over them or throw Tomahawk missiles from a distance at them, how long can you do that? That's strikes. That's a punch. That doesn't win the fight. In the long run, what countries I think have learned is if you can absorb the initial strikes, time is on your side. Look, the economic attack on Russia was essentially one of these, I would call it like this, an economic decapitation strike. When the Ukraine conflict happened, the goal of the U.S. was to launch an economic strike, right? An economic decapitation strike. It was going to be so powerful against Russia that it was going to totally destroy their economy, and all the Russians were all going to run Vladimir Putin out and stand with flowers waiting for the neoliberal, waiting for John Bolton to come, sauntering into a Red Square. That was, the absurdity of what these people thought. But the bottom line was this. that economic decapitation strike didn't work because their decapitation strikes don't work anymore. And now they got their fingers crossed and they're holding their breath because in this day and age, they know that there's a lot of technology out there that could hurt them. And they're not sure just how much of that technology Venezuela has. What does it have as far as drones? How many drones? Does it have the latest Chinese drones? Does it have the latest Russian drones? Does it have the latest Iranian drones? Torpedoes, anti-ship missiles, what's it have? So they got to hold their breath saying, we'll launch a decapitation strike, attempted decapitation strike because it won't work, but we'll launch this against Venezuela, not really knowing how they're able to respond, not really having an idea the capacity they have to respond. Well, that bit wouldn't be too bright because what happens if you find out the hard way that they have significant capacity to respond? And some of that capacity to respond is like an Onyx P5 or P6, whatever it is, missile, anti-ship missiles, and they come whistling in and really, they can sink a ship with a single hit. And you can lose a lot of soldiers. Do you want to take that chance? Can you fly over them? I mean, initially, you're just going to have to stand back and throw tomahawks or missiles, attack them, or whatever. You connect to these F-35s or whatever you got, F-18s, because you're not going to be able to, you do really want to overfly there and take a chance of getting some planes shot down. Bottom line, then, if Trump would do this, and especially if soldiers start dying, that's why the empire has to strike. That's why the empire can't go to war. That the empire doesn't have a sufficient size expeditionary land force to accomplish its goals, shall we say. What do the Russians always talk about? Accomplishing all the goals of the special military operation. We're not going to stop till we accomplish the goals. That's what they say, right? The U.S. does not have, and in order, again, go back to that book or go back to any military book. When they talk about your goals, right? And your goals ultimately, not usually, but your goals ultimately are political goals. There are military goals that correspond with political goals, more military goals that will allow you to accomplish political goals, right? But do your goals correspond with your ability? I want a McLaren, and I want a collection of supercars at 500,000 each. Great. That is my goal. Does that correspond with my capacity? No, I don't have the money to buy one supercar, much less 5. I can't buy a tire on a supercar, right? How much for that tire? Yeah, 50 grand. I can't buy that tire, right? So I can't even buy a super bicycle, much less a supercar. But I'm being facetious. You get my point. So the means to accomplish our goal of overthrowing Venezuela, does the United States have the means to do that? I think that's the question we're talking about. I think that's why they use the terms of strikes. Strikes are not the means to accomplish the political goals. Strikes are not a good means for accomplishing long-term political goals. So strikes are something to, it's one of those things that the neocons have convinced themselves that it works, even though there's like no instance where it really did work, but they've convinced themselves that it will work. It's part of their talking points. We're going to launch strikes, decapitation strikes, part of their talking points. But look what happens when they do it. So the best the machine can do now, the best the machine can do is put together some protests like they did recently with violent protests in Mexico, but they didn't work because now governments know when the violent protests start, just write them out. Don't worry about it. Just, put a little bit of suppression on it and ride them out. They'll go away. And when they go away, you'll be okay. And that's all Mexico did. And that's all countries did. So the whole color revolution doesn't work real well because people ride them out. The whole, we're going to launch decapitation strikes never really worked because A, it makes the people circle the wagons. And B, in this day and age, people know what you're going to do. So they'll just hide all of their leadership. And even if you do, such as in Iran, when they lost a number of members of their leadership, they had competent people right behind them. Look, if you've got a general, the guy behind him that wants to be general next is pretty damn competent and could be as good as he is. It's like you watch a professional game, football, whatever it is, and a player gets hurt and the backup guy comes on and the backup is just as good as the guy that just got hurt. Okay? Because they're professionals and they're good at what they do. And there's not a dramatic difference between the number 1 guy and the number 2 guy often in their ability. So these so-called surgical strikes and decapitation strikes where you take out the leadership. Well, usually, look at golf. I mean, the number one golfer and the number two golfer, and you look at all of the numbers and their, what they do. One may win more tournaments, but if you look at their, actual numbers, they're not all that far apart. There's not a big difference in pro golf between the number one guy and the number 10 guy. These people at the top are really bunched up together. So my point is this: your so-called decapitation strike, when you get rid of somebody at the top, the person right under that guy is pretty damn good. So everybody already knows, just move up one. Everybody moves up one, and you still have a very competent leadership team, as we saw in Iran. And what did they do? They got themselves together. They got their air defense system going, and they knocked the crap out of the occupied area. Right? They hit them back hard. So that whole, I think that particular instance wasn't the only time that the whole shock and awe, decapitation, strikes, blah, 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 was discredited. But I think that was one of the most recent and one of the most profound examples, because they got everything they wanted, right? They got terrorist strikes, they got the missiles, they got some bombing in because they were able to get some air defense system now for a while. So the plan for shock and awe, the plan for decapitation worked the way they expected, right? But they didn't get the outcome. So what they wanted to do happened, but it didn't produce the outcome that they thought it would produce. That's ultimately all it was. So my point being, when you talk about this business of shock and awe, when you talk about this business of surgical strikes, surface to surface missiles and all these kinds of things, where you're going to decapitate the leadership of this country, you're going to bomb all this stuff for a couple days or a couple weeks at the most, and that's going to accomplish your political goals? No, because ultimately, here's the reality about Venezuela, and as we're seeing in Ukraine as a perfect example, the U.S. and its allies, vassals, whatever you call them, they don't have the means to accomplish their political goals. They don't have the means to defeat Russia. They don't have the means to defeat Russia in the economic or military or diplomatic sphere. They just don't have. Their political goals and their military goals don't align. I also personally believe that about Venezuela, that the United States does not have the means to accomplish the goal that it would like to accomplish in Venezuela. And that if Donald Trump does something that's stupid, which he may, but I doubt it, he's going to be humiliated anyway, because if he puts everything there and says, we're going to go get him, and he doesn't, then he's kind of humiliated. And the Venezuelans say, see, we stood up to the Americans. We stood up to the gringos, right? But if he attacks, I think it's going to be even worse. Politically, it's going to be real painful. And under normal circumstances, here is what I would say, it'll be real hard to get out. But for Trump, Trump will just leave. I will say this to Trump. If Trump starts throwing tomahawks at Venezuela, and Venezuela starts throwing some nasty missiles back, and the U.S. are taking a hit, Trump will declare victory and get the hell out. Now, he will do that. Generally, the U.S. won't, but Trump will. So that's where we are, I think. I just wanted to make the point about, it's a short video, but I wanted to make the point about the term strikes to get people to think about what that is. It implies a single or a very few hits on a target, strike a target. It doesn't imply war. It doesn't imply anything long-term. It implies that you have the capacity to get a short-term attack producing a long-term effect. A short-term attack is going to give you a long-term victory, so you're going to run the country. Well, this country, that's the target. So that's not the way things work in the real world. And as I see it, the United States no longer has the capacity as a land force to really overthrow countries or anything, period. If we can't do it through some kind of a color revolution and people marching around the street, with nicely printed signs and things like that, if the U.S. can't do it that way, it ain't happening. Venezuela, we'll see. I just don't think. I don't see how the U.S. does this. And if Trump does, I think, as I've said before, at some point his goose is cooked. Thanks a lot, everybody. Certainly appreciate you guys taking time out on what's today, Wednesday night, You can, as you see everybody, everything there, if you can afford to, whether it's Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, whatever, that's appreciated. However, and there's my PO box, so you can mail whatever you want to the PO box. But the most important thing you can do, and this is really critical, actually, I believe this, whether it's my show or any other show, I don't care who it is. If you see a show that you like, share it on all your social media platforms, because the people that doing these shows don't get a lot of money, don't get advertisements, don't get much of anything. But 323 people in the chat who put something out there, if it's this show or another show, if you share it on your social media platforms, that's the kind of advertisement that we could never afford. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day. I'm out.